Welcome to the Politics and Public Finance Podcast, in-depth conversations that bring unique insights into the nexus between how governments manage our finances and the work of elected representative bodies such as parliaments. You're listening to Politics and Public Finance Podcast with Jeff Dubrow.
Welcome to Politics and Public Finance. This week, Tim Jones, the head of policy for debt justice in the UK, talks about the debt crisis and the role of civil society. A fascinating interview. Tim is going to talk about a couple of really important issues. One of them is the amount of predatory private sector lending that goes on, that is at the heart of the debt crisis in so many countries around the world. And he'll also talk about the role of civil society organizations, both his organization in the United Kingdom, but also local organizations in countries that are in debt distress. What is their role in advocating for debt transparency, debt forgiveness, and responsible lending and borrowing? That interview coming up right now. Tim Jones, head of policy for debt justice in the UK. Welcome to Politics and Public Finance.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Really appreciate your time, Tim. Let's start with the gravity of the current debt crisis. Let's put it in context. How grave is the current global debt crisis?
It's pretty bad. We estimate around 54 countries that their debt situations are so bad it's dramatically impacting on the ability of governments to meet basic needs, help fund public services. In a historic sense, we had a huge crisis across many countries in the 1980s and 1990s, and then that kind of was brought to an end in many of them during the 2000s. At the moment, debt payments are now back up to around the same level as 2001. So we're getting back to the same level of debts as in the 1980s and 1990s, which is very scary because that was a time of huge public spending cuts, of 2 lost decades of development.
When we look at the situation in Sri Lanka right now, I think basic services are starting to shut down, including schools. Have we seen that in previous debt crises as well, sort of waves of debt crises in the past?
Yeah, there's in the 80s and 90s, there were in some countries big falls in outcomes for healthcare or for education. So it's not unprecedented that we actually see backward steps being taken on public services, a decline in services that are being provided to people.
That's really interesting. We as you know, Politics and Public Finance, we had a previous episode on the debt trap. And one of the issues that came up was the compounding crises. I know that COVID-19 put the sort of the global debt crisis even to a more tense position. Certainly feel free to talk about that. But how is the crisis, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, how has that impacted on the global debt crisis?
Yeah, it's had yet another dramatic impact on top of, as you say, the previous things that have happened. The direct impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine that we've seen is the increase in energy prices and food prices. And so for countries that import either energy or food, that has a huge detrimental impact, that the costs of those things go up. And the way you pay for imports is with foreign currency. And also the way you pay for foreign debts is with foreign currency. So you have these two things that are competing over where that scarce foreign currency that you have as a country goes. And so if you're spending a lot on debts already, it means you've got less to use to pay for these increased prices of energy and food. But it also goes beyond that because we've seen impacts in financial markets as well. So in the Western world, after many years of low interest rates are now being increased quite rapidly in order supposedly to try and get inflation under control. There's limited evidence it will do that, but that's why Western countries are increasing interest rates. And that has a knock-on impact of increasing interest rates even more in lower income countries. And then the final knock-on impact of that is that speculators are now moving money back to the Western world And so that is increasing, again, the ability of governments to borrow more money or increasing interest rates. So it's all causing a huge financial crunch on countries just at the time when they actually need more money.
So let's unpack that for a moment. When you say speculators, who are the speculators? Are those Lehman Brothers type banks, or who are we talking about?
Yeah, so there's a range of companies that are involved in buying up debts of lower income countries. So it's asset managers. BlackRock is the largest one of those in the world. There's specialist hedge funds that buy up debts, especially when they're cheap, in order to try and make large profits. Often they've been known as vulture funds. There's also global banks, both buy up certain kinds of these debts, but also lend money directly. And in some countries, there's also oil trading companies like Glencore that have lent lots of money guaranteed by oil shipments. So there's a huge host of multinational companies are involved in this and who claim to be owed debts by lower income countries.
So would we characterize it as private sector debt then?
Yes, so that's a big chunk of the debt. So over coming years for lower income countries, around half of their debt payments are to private companies. The other debt payments, about a third, are to multilateral institutions like the IMF and World Bank. And then the remainder is owed to other governments like China or France or Japan.
So I guess I really haven't, in my interest in the subject, as you know, I do a lot of work in this area, but on my interest in the subject, I haven't really paid as much attention to the private sector debt, I guess. With the exception of understanding the role of Credit Suisse in the Mozambique scandals in 2014, I think it was. So I always sort of thought that it was the sort of Chinese lending that was the highest risk because of the opacity of some of the loan agreements, because of the fact that they've been repossessing strategic infrastructure from countries as I guess repayments to loans that can't be made, or collateral for loans that can't be made. I'm getting the feeling that I've been overlooking that private sector debt risk. Can you talk a bit more about the intensity of that risk?
Yeah, so the private lenders are the ones that lend at the highest interest rates. So it's ballpark figures, but private lenders have tended to be charging about 6 to 10% interest. China is more like 3%, and then the IMF and World Bank, you get down to more like 1%. So the highest risk debt is generally private debt, and much as I completely agree, there's lots of problems with lending transparency on the part of China, but it's also true about the private sector. So you mentioned the Credit Suisse Scandal in Mozambique, where $2 billion was lent, much of it in secret at the time, but generally there are no standards on private lenders to disclose the existence of their loans. So it's very difficult for parliamentarians, for civil society to investigate private loans, just as it is for them to investigate Chinese loans. All are important in the big picture, but actually there's far more private loans than there are loans from China.
That's absolutely fascinating, and I the title of this podcast, this particular episode, is debt justice and the role of civil society. So maybe we can make that as a segue in. You had a campaign related to a call to action. That is, your organization, Debt Justice, called for a social media blast to BlackRock to cancel Zambia's debt. I was in Zambia on a mission very recently, so I'm very interested. That's why I sort of pulled this out of your calls to action. Can you talk a bit about BlackRock's role in that context, now that you've mentioned that they are the largest private sector lender, if I understood that correctly?
Yeah. So I'll try and explain it briefly. In the mid 2010s, there was a lot of lending to Zambia. The copper price was high, and these loans were given at an average of 8% interest. Then the copper price fell, and people who'd lent the money were like, oh, Zambia might not be able to pay. And the price of those debts then fell on financial markets. Now, at some point over the years, and we don't know exactly when, BlackRock, along many other private companies, bought up debts at those lower prices. And then Zambia kept paying up until the pandemic. So they've already been making quite a lot of money on those high interest rates. When the pandemic began, the G20 group of self-appointed most important countries created this scheme to suspend debt payments. But it was debt payments to governments like China, and they just called on private lenders to do the same, and private lenders said no. And so the debt payments to private lenders kept being paid whilst those to China were suspended. Then Zambia explicitly requested a suspension of its payments to private lenders. Again, they said no, including BlackRock explicitly said no, we expect you to keep paying. Zambia at that point then stopped paying. They just defaulted, which in our view is the right thing to do, and in many ways happened too late because the private lenders had been expecting Zambia to stop paying for many years. So they've kind of been wasting the money over the years paying these high interest debts. So now Zambia is going through a process of trying to negotiate restructuring of its debt with its private lenders and with China and other governments that it owes money to. But those private lenders haven't been engaging with the negotiations. The Zambian Civil Society Debt Alliance, along with us, have written to them. They refuse to respond. The UK Parliamentary Committee asked BlackRock to come and speak to them and give evidence. They refused to turn up.
Is that a British company based in the UK?
Yeah, so it's based in the UK, and ultimately it's housed in the US, but it has a huge operation in the UK. And these Zambian debts are also governed by English law, so it's the very UK part of the story. So yes, we think Zambia needs at least 2/3 of its debt cancelled to make it sustainable. BlackRock is the largest known private creditor to Zambia, so we're been campaigning on them to cancel the debt as part of this overall scheme that needs to happen across the board, because Zambia just has a huge unpayable debt. Its social spending between 2019 and 2021 fell by 21% in the name of paying this debt, which is just horrific, especially at a time of pandemic. And we now need to see that debt being cancelled so that Zambia can recover from the crisis it's in.
That's fascinating. I have a whole bunch of questions. I guess the first one was, Zambia is a low-income country. Why couldn't it get concessional loans from the World Bank or other multilateral lenders instead of going to private sector lenders for high interest rates?
Yeah, so they're a lower middle income country, but they can get
lower middle. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but they can get concessional loans from the World Bank, so of lower interest. They're probably paying about 2% interest on their World Bank loans. For whatever reason, they chose to borrow more. So there's a limited amount you can get from the likes of the World Bank. They chose to go and borrow more. I think, and the partners we work with in Zambia would say that was very questionable. Borrowing these private loans in foreign currency at 8% interest would have to be really well invested in order for it to get the returns to justify that kind of investment. Obviously, Zambia has huge needs of its population that need to be met. But the evidence is, both our research and people like the IMF's research, that if you borrow at these kind of interest rates from private lenders, you actually tend to have less money available to invest in public spending rather than more. So so we would argue that it was the wrong decision, but that doesn't mean that therefore the debt should be repaid, because the wrong decision was also on the lender's part. What were the lenders doing, lending this money at 8% interest to Zambia in the first place? And actually their justification is that they were lending at high interest because Zambia was risky and might not be able to repay. Well, guess what? We've had a global pandemic. We've had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, unprecedented inflation for the last 30, 40 years. That risk has materialized. Those private lenders need to not be repaid. They gambled and they need to accept they lost. rather than seek mass profits out of the country.
That's really interesting. It's interesting also, and I'll move off Zambia, but Zambia has a constitutional requirement that parliaments ratify all loan agreements, but there's no legislation in place that actually permits that. So it would be interesting to see what kind of scrutiny would have been in place if there was parliamentary oversight over the ratification of those loan agreements, to sort of actually get a justification for why Zambia is borrowing at 8%. So that's really interesting, Tim. Are you familiar with the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development's principles on promoting responsible sovereign lending and borrowing?
Yeah.
So because those principles they are in a sense a framework for talking about the responsibilities of lenders, right? Underscoring the fact that lenders have a responsibility to provide information to sovereign customers to assist in making borrowing decisions. They need to make responsible credit decisions based on ability to pay. Do those types of standards have any impact in the work that you do?
So those kind of standards that the UN have created have an impact for us in that we want to see those things happen.
Yeah.
They seem to have little impact on the lenders. And this is at all levels. So we've seen private lenders they've probably never heard. If you quoted those principles at BlackRock, my guess is they have never heard of them, to be honest. And so they're driven by what they think can make the most return. And that's where there's only so far principles can get you. You need to regulate these companies in order to do those things. So one of the most basic things is transparency. And for many of those other principles to be met, one of the key things is, do people in the country concerned know that this loan exists and know the terms on which it's being given? And it could be very simply done in the US and the UK. You could bring in regulations to make private lenders disclose that information. We've actually been arguing for this since the Mozambique scandal. And the private sector responded by saying, oh, you don't need to regulate us, we'll do this voluntarily.
Sure.
So they then created their own principles, which aren't as good as the UN ones, but do through something called the Institute of International Finance,
right.
says that banks will disclose the existence of loans to lower income countries. And those principles were signed up to in 2019. 3 years later, only 2 banks have made any disclosures under that scheme. So
wow.
that's where voluntary principles have got us. So those banks, we need those banks to actually fulfill the voluntary principles they signed up to, but it also just shows that you actually need to regulate them and make them do it because they're not doing it by themselves.
So let's move really square on to the role of civil society. Sort of 2-part question: the role of international organizations like Debt Justice in the UK, and the role of local organizations particularly in low and middle income countries in advocating for increased transparency. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so from our side and organizations like us working in richer countries, we are trying to hold the lenders to account. So either to get the rules in place to get things like lending transparency, or to push banks to disclose information up front, and then to investigate and interrogate cases like the Mozambique scandal. And following our campaign, Credit Suisse has now actually been fined several $100 million for its role in the Mozambique scandal. It in no way offsets the damage that was done to Mozambique, but it is some slap on the wrist to them, which might have some impact on discouraging other banks to do that. So
just on that question, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I really you got me really interested here. So what does that look like? What does a campaign to get Credit Suisse fined actually look like?
What it looked like was us working closely with a group called the Budget Monitoring Forum in Mozambique, who are grave personal risk to themselves have driven this campaign, both in Mozambique and internationally. So they've launched legal actions to try and get people in Mozambique held responsible, to try and get the debts declared illegal in Mozambique. But they also recognise the power of international actors on the situation. So the campaigners came to the UK. We had events in Parliament. We got questions asked. Our supporters in the UK and the Budget Monitoring Forum's members in Mozambique had joined letter writing campaigns to decision makers in the UK. And they also went to Washington, to the IMF, to the World Bank, and to US regulators. And so that kind of joined up campaigning led by a group in Mozambique and then supported by us, I think helped keep the issue on the agenda and put pressure on the regulators to take some action, albeit short of everything that we would want to see. But then, yes, the civil society then also within in holding their own governments and parliaments to account, it's trying to demand access to that information, demand early access to the information so that you know what loans are being considered before they're being signed, not just when contracts are signed, and challenging where is this money going? Is this the best use of the money? Is it really affordable to borrow at these kinds of interest rates? And then when you get to the situation that many countries are in now, where debts are huge, generally lenders have stopped lending to countries like Zambia or Mozambique or Ghana, challenging the government on their strategy now, because often what governments say is, oh, we have to keep paying our debts because we need access to international financial markets. But that access has normally already been lost, and it's just costing countries money to keep paying and delaying the inevitable and making the inevitable worse. So you referenced Sri Lanka at the start. Sri Lanka was just last year, like the people in financial markets were like, why is Sri Lanka still paying us the debt? Because they're going to run out of money very soon. And unfortunately, they have. So now they've defaulted anyway, but they have no foreign currency reserves left to help deal with the situation. So it's a far worse situation in Sri Lanka than if they'd stopped paying sooner and sought the debt restructuring sooner. So governments also need to be challenged on their approach to that strategy of paying the debt or not paying the debt and trying to deal with the crisis preemptively, rather than just waiting till there is no option other than stopping paying because the money has run out.
So psychologically, there is a very negative connotation associated with defaulting on the payment or not pursuing the payment. And governments are very reticent to do that because I think they're going to lose access to the financial markets. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that's completely wrong. And it's something the private sector lobbyers help to create. So defaulting is a good thing. Like stopping paying the debt to rich lenders and having the money to protect your own economy, that is a good thing to do. And so we need to kind of switch that round and change how it's conceptualized. Now, it doesn't mean you should have been in that situation in the first place, but if you're in that situation, defaulting is better than not paying. The reason given why countries should keep paying is that, oh, you'll never be able to borrow again, which just isn't true. So when a country has a big debt crisis like Zambia or Ghana, the private lenders have already stopped lending. So you can't borrow any more money from them now anyway. The argument is over the future. And in the future, a private lender is far more willing to lend to a country that has restructured the debt and got it down to a sustainable level. They're not going to lend to a country with a high debt. So actually, and this evidence from people like the IMF or the ratings agency Scope Ratings shows this, to be able to borrow again in the future, you need to restructure your debt, reach a deal to get some of it cancelled so it gets down to a sustainable level.
Would the IMF be in a position? Would the IMF be reinforcing that sort of I don't know what to call that assumption that you've got to pay your debt till debt do you part, so to speak?
The IMF plays different roles in this, and it's probably easiest not to see them as one institution. So there's parts of the IMF that have pointed out that countries pay debts for too long and that debt restructurings happen too late and are too little. But then there is also a part of the IMF that kind of keeps the system going and enables that to happen. And so the standard way of dealing with a debt crisis in the world since the 1980s is for the IMF and World Bank to lend more money, which enables the debt to keep being paid to the private lenders, but maintains the debt crisis in the country concerned. And that is effectively a mass bailout of private lenders through public money. And this is what happened at the start of the 1980s, and we're at risk of doing the same now. So when the COVID pandemic began, there was lots of increased lending from the IMF, and much of that has then gone on paying off private lenders. And then in 20 years' time, if they keep doing it, they might end up doing debt cancellation on the public money long after the private lenders have been paid off. And this is one of the reasons why the private lenders keep acting recklessly, because they know that they'll get bailed out. So the IMF is kind of this enabler of the system, but also it contradicts itself because it critiques the system and says that countries do pay too long. And so on one level, I think you've got to see the IMF is ultimately run by its rich member governments. And so you could question, what do European governments, the UK, the US, when they see a country about to default on their private lenders, they seem to be very happy for that country to be lent the money to keep paying. And that's what happened in Argentina in 2018. But there is, also some kind of pressure, I think, within the IMF to challenge that system. And just my final point on this, I've once had people on the inside of negotiations say it can be very difficult because we're saying this country needs to restructure its debt, but if a government insists on keeping on paying, what do we then do? So the IMF do need to refuse to bail out private creditors, but also governments need to be empowered to stand up to private creditors and say, actually, we're stopping paying. This is not going to mean the world's going to end. It means some rich people are not going to get some money for a while, and we're going to have some money for our people.
Wow. So if you push the reset button on the whole process, the whole sort of lending process and debt accumulation process, what would it look like?
Oh, well, I don't think I can cover everything, but yeah, the simplest things are that before any loan is given, it would need to go through parliamentary scrutiny and media and civil society scrutiny. And the lender is only willing to sign off on the loan if that has all happened and it's been made clear where the funds are going, what this is used for, how it's going to be evaluated. And there is also a clear system as if it goes wrong, if there are external shocks like global pandemic, there are mechanisms that can then restructure that debt and make sure it remains affordable. Or if the project goes wrong, if it's a loan for a particular project and ends up not working, then the lender helps share in the costs of it not working. So that, yeah, there is the consequences on both sides to the how lending and borrowing works, and that there's accountability throughout.
One final question. How do we get the private sector on side? You mentioned the IIF principles and then only 2 banks have signed on. Is there any hope for the future?
So to make private lenders be transparent, we have one very simple suggestion. So virtually all international debt contracts are governed by either New York or UK law. And private lenders want to use them because they have a whole history of case law of how to enforce debts where they need to. So we suggest that you add a new part of legislation that says if you want to enforce a debt in those jurisdictions, it has to have been publicly disclosed when the loan was given. And that would mean that both the private lenders, when they initially give the loan, but also crucially anyone buying that debt, will want to see, has this been publicly disclosed? Because otherwise we haven't got an enforcement mechanism for the debt. And so it's a base standard that would kind of push the private lenders into being transparent. If somebody really wanted to give a loan in secret, they might still be able to, but it would be at much higher cost, and so should act as a deterrent on that. There might be other ways to regulate banks to do it as well, but the UK and New York, between them, have the power to do it. The other thing is that the reason why these IAF principles were agreed in the first place was because there was started to be talk of this kind of regulation. So it's the threat of regulation is what will make them start to comply with their voluntary principles. But to be honest, the best thing to do is just to regulate them anyway. But even threatening them might mean more banks start disclosing. But to get all of them, we need to regulate them.
Absolutely fascinating. Tim Jones, the head of policy at Debt Justice in the UK. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Wow, what an amazing conversation. Thanks again to Tim Jones from Debt Justice in the UK. And that is our podcast for today. Politics and Public Finance is produced and sponsored by Huge Impact Marketing. Wherever you're listening to this podcast, be sure to subscribe. I'm Jeff Dubrow. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.